Our descendants have the means to return to greatness!
Hello guys, welcome to another video. Now yesterday I released a video discussing some of the maths behind the upcoming changes to the Ruby, Topaz and Sapphire flasks in 3.24. And I do want to mention here that even though these changes weren't mentioned specifically by Mark in that teaser, I think it's pretty obvious that they wanted to showcase that change in the teaser. And for those that are out of the loop, that change is basically that Ruby, Topaz and Sapphire flasks are being changed from granting 50% resistance and 20% less damage taken to 40% resistance and plus 5% to maximum resistance of their respective resistance type. Now in yesterday's video I went over the basic overview of that change, and I'll link that video in the description below if you'd like to check it out. However, in this video I wanted to discuss a few things that I didn't mention in that video, and this is mostly going to be a bit of theorycraft and just throwing out some ideas. So the first thing we should discuss is Transcendence. That's a timeless keystone which applies your armor value to elemental damage taken, and this happens after resistance mitigation. In the past, ever since Transcendence was changed from -5% to -15% to all maximum elemental resistances, the go-to use of this keystone has been with Lawweave, since that body armor sets your maximum resistances to the specified value, so you can completely overcome that massive resistance penalty. And this is usually a very expensive high-end setup, often requiring a double corrupted Dawnbreaker, a double purity mod Watcher's Eye, and a lot of flask effect with Taste of Hate to deal with the physical damage that you're going to be taking, since the body armor slot is now occupied with Lawweave, so you can't use Lightning Coil. However, a bit more recently, with things such as Charms in the Affliction League, or Tattoos in the Trial of the Ancestors League, or even the modifiers on shields from Crucible trees during Crucible League, some players have experimented with using Transcendence without Lawweave and trying to scale maximum resistances to counter the massive resistance penalty through other means. And some builds, such as Konagi's Pathfinder, which I covered here on this channel a while back, just completely ignored the resistance penalty and rolled with 55 or 60% maximum elemental resistances, which is crazy. But things are changing in Path of Exile in quite a big way in 3.24 with these elemental flask changes. And the new flasks are going to provide a much more consistent way to gain a bunch of maximum resistances compared to things like Charms and Tattoos, which are typically gone once the league is over. And I think this is going to change up the meta for how those top-end defensive builds are put together, mainly on Pathfinders or Mageblood characters. There's one thing which stood out to me in a big way on seeing these changes for the first time, and that's the fact that Melding of the Flesh exists, and previously there was no way of converting the less damage taken modifier on one of those elemental flasks to also apply to the other two elemental damage types, which is why the massive majority of builds ran all three flasks, that's Ruby, Topaz and Sapphire, to shore up defenses against almost everything that came their way. And this is also why the Tempered by War setup with Dawnbreaker and the Purity of Fire Sublime Vision started to become very popular, as it's so incredibly powerful to be able to focus all of your defenses onto one damage type and significantly lessen your risk to elemental penetration. But with Ruby, Topaz and Sapphire flasks changing in 3.24 to provide maximum resistance instead, a new option opens up to use a single flask to gain maximum resistances for each elemental type using Melding of the Flesh. And that means that scaling maximum resistances with Transcendence may become the go-to for very high-end defensive setups for things like Valdo map or Uberboss farming. And if this does start to become a popular way to build around Transcendence, I think items like Aegis or Aura will start to be used even more than they already are, especially since a build that isn't using Lawweave will have the body armor slot freed up for use with something like Lightning Coil, which will make Dawnbreaker no longer a mandatory item to reach 100% physical damage shift. I'll also mention the Traitor. This is another timeless keystone that I touched on briefly in yesterday's video. Now obviously you can't use this together with Transcendence, since both of these are exclusive to timeless jewels which are limited to one. But the Traitor does provide access to the melding tech to gain maximum resistances for all three elements from a single flask, And something I didn't talk about in yesterday's video is the Micro Distillery Belt, which pairs very nicely with the Traitor as you'll already be keeping at least one of your flask slots empty. This belt grants a huge chunk of flask effect, 30% in fact, which is the equivalent of 1 or 2% maximum resistance depending on the amount of flask effect you have from other sources. Remember that each increment of 20% flask effect will now provide an additional 1% maximum resistance with the new flasks. So I expect to see some builds using this combination of mechanics. This is also great on the Chieftain, which doesn't need the Melding of the Flesh jewel, and gaining a bunch of maximum fire resistance from the flask slot will allow a massive amount of freedom in gearing, which will be interesting. I look forward to seeing what players can come up with using that setup. Something else that I think is worth mentioning here is that a Pathfinder setup using Melding of the Flesh would be freeing up 2 flask slots that were previously being used for the other 2 elemental flasks. And this is a bit weird and it's completely cursed, but bear with me here. You'll now be able to use 2 identical flasks, such as 2 Magic Sapphire flasks, or even 2 Taste of Hate flasks, and have them enchanted using Enkindling Orbs for up to 70% increased flask effect, and you'd need to alternate uses between the 2 so that the other can gain charges while it's not in use. I did tell you that it was cursed, but this would maximise the amount of maximum resistances you can get out of a flask for the setup. You may even be able to obtain 12 or 13% maximum resistance if you're doing this with magic flasks. And I think overall we are going to see a pretty big shift to those endgame or very endgame high investment setups. And one thing that definitely stands out about this change is that those builds are going to struggle with elemental penetration a lot more than they used to. So it's going to be really interesting to see how the meta adapts to those changes come 3.24. But yeah, I just wanted to make this video to compile my thoughts on these flask changes a little bit more. And I do think at the very high end, the Transcendence setup is going to be quite effective. I'm interested to hear what you think about these flask changes, especially if you're someone who plays some of those high-end Pathfinder builds, or maybe some Mageblood builds, the ones that have the really high potential defensive setup. Or perhaps you're someone who is looking at these changes, and you don't play Pathfinder builds, but you're interested to see what happens with other ascendancies making use of these new tools. Let me know in the comment section down below. Thank you for watching this video, and thank you to my supporters over on Patreon. Your support is appreciated. If you'd like to support this channel, you can head over to the new Patreon that I've created. The link is in the description below. As always, stay tuned and stay safe.